Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Film Haven Reviews. I'm your host Sawyer as always, and today we are, as you can tell, not doing the movie that I had been talking about us doing, Night of the Lepus. And there are reasons for that that I'll get into shortly. But today we are deciding to do Night of the Living Dead, the classic from 1968. And we're finishing up the Night of the theme. And there's really no better way than to do it with this movie that is so influential and so precedential. But I was avoiding doing it because I had seen the movie before. But we're breaking the rules a little bit due to basically an emergency because obviously the episode needs to come out, and I'm not doing Night of the Lepus anymore, and I've already reviewed Night of the Demons, so I'm running out of Night of the movies that are worth anything. So that's really what was going on there. Now, Night of the Lepus, for those of you who don't know, which is probably most of you, it's about a movie. It's a movie about giant bunny rabbits attacking a town, and they're trying to kill the rabbits. And then I don't know why I didn't think about it that much and be like, oh, I don't really like animal cruelty in horror movies. And um, the beginning of the movie had a lot of animal death. There within the first 2 minutes, a horse was being shot to death, and then it's kind of famously the worst sound in the world, the sound of bunnies screaming and screeching, and there's a lot of that in the first like 10 minutes. So. Allie was watching it with me, and she was like, "Well, I'm not doing this," and I was like, "You know what? I'm not either." So, Night of the Lepus is off. We're never going to touch that movie, and it was horrible. So 0 out of 10. If I can't make it to the first 10 minutes, then you've got a bad movie on your hands. So yeah, Night of the Lepus. We'll do a quick review of that. 0 out of 10. Animal cruelty is not fun in horror movies, and no one really likes it. I don't know why they even do it as much as they do anyway, even in movies that I enjoy. So let's move on. Night of the Living Dead. Let's get that poster up here. Yeah, it's a great poster. I love this one here. Very classic movie, as we'll get into. So I'm going to try to be a little bit more structured these days with my episodes, especially since now we're on video, and so I don't start rambling off here and there. So I've got a little bit more of a structure. So let's just get into an overview of the movie real fast before we get into kind of the guts of it. So to begin with, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. So maybe not as high as some people might expect, but definitely not a bad score. I got the same to Night of the Creeps, and hard to say. I think I may have enjoyed my experience with Night of the Creeps a little bit more, but there's obviously so much more to this movie than to Night of the Creeps, especially considering the precedents and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it was literally there would be no Night of the Creeps if there wasn't Night of the Living Dead. So there you go. Although the movie itself is great, like I said, the precedence is really strong in this movie, stronger than most movies, probably more than any of the movies that I've done so far. When I'm thinking about it, I mean, there are a few, but I mean, this is the origins of an entire genre of films, zombie movies. They don't even, funny enough, they don't even say the word zombie in the movie. They use the word ghoul sometimes, and then they say those things. It's the living dead. Obviously, now we know it as zombies, but so much precedence here. We have the start of having to shoot them in the head if you want to kill them. That starts here. So the brain is what connects zombies to death, and then you've got the eating of cannibalizing, eating of flesh. I mean, so many things that are very zombie like. Just the way they move, of course. There's some differences though that we'll get into a little bit later. One of the things I liked about this movie was kind of comparing the zombie features to this movie to other movies that I've seen. So we'll get into that later. And then also just 1968, man. Wow. Like this movie was way ahead of its time in a lot of ways. And because this movie came out and was such a hit at the time, it actually influenced so many of the directors in the 70s that would actually create like modern horror, especially in the slasher genres and stuff like that. So this movie was really on the cutting edge of a lot of things. And it was also a real ragtag kind of independent venture from George Romero. So we definitely getting some independent vibes, some kind of rogue vibes here, which is really cool. And that's one of the things I like about it too. Getting into the next thing I liked in this overview is the rogue-like cinematography. It's very good. It's like even the actual camera work, which is it's filmed on a 35 millimeter, and he's definitely using the camera almost as a character, which is one of the things I really liked about movies in general. When that happens, I just watched Presence. I'll probably be talking about that later on another video, but the movie that just came out in January, and that movie very interesting the way the camera of the movie is literally a character in the film. I think the movie Nickel Boys, which I still need to watch, is also similar to that, where it's in the person's point of view. This one is more a little bit more like it's not an actual person. It's just that's the way the camera style is. I really enjoy that. It's very voyeuristic in a lot of ways at points. But there's also like we'll get into it a little bit more. Actually, I'll save that for later. I'm trying to do an overview right here. So that's a really cool thing. The cinematography, very interesting, roguelike, very ragtag, but it works for the vibe. It actually enhances sometimes the fear, which is really cool. The next thing was like the premise is just really engaging. I mean, once again, talking about precedents, like I said, this is one of the more like precedent-setting movies, influential movies that I've ever done, at least on the podcast. And yeah, you can definitely tell from just the archetype of the story. I mean, you have a survival horror situation happening at a farmhouse, very much something that is emulated in other things. See, what's the show? The Walking Dead season 2, when they're at the farmhouse, and then there's a lot of different video games and stuff like that where the zombies last stand at a farmhouse happens. It's very much a classic thing, and some of the characters in the story are very archetypal to future survival horror movies and definitely zombie movies. So next thing, we have the practical effects. I mean, come on. Some of the practical effects in this movie are just really astounding for the time. 1968. You don't see, I mean, I don't even think they were using blood packs yet. I could be wrong here, but the Western The Wild Bunch, I think that's 1969 possibly. I need to fact check that. Yes, The Wild Bunch was 1969, and that movie is famously very bloody and gory, and that's where kind of one of the first movies that was starting to really use a lot of gore, and you have a lot of like blood packs and stuff, which is very famous practical effects ways to, when you shoot a gun and someone's like blood comes out of their a gun hole, and that's actually just a blood pack that they have kind of designed to explode with blood, that kind of thing. That starts happening a lot in the 70s, especially the early 70s, and you got movies like Lady Snowblood from 1971, and stuff like that. Like you can see this is like kind of just before that integration and progression of gore and blood effects in movies. I mean, there definitely have been obviously movies in the 60s and some giallos and stuff like that that have some good blood effects, but it still didn't really hit until the 70s is when it really hit its stride. And this is one of those really early movies that has a shocking amount of gore. We'll get into that later as well. So especially for 1968, a lot of gore. And then one of the things about this movie, kind of going back to the fact that this kind of independent ragtag kind of style, is that the movie was on a 114K budget, which to me, I'm still like, that's tons of money and back then it's a lot of money. But still for any kind of major release or theatrical release, that's still a lot of not a lot of money for a budget. It's pretty shoestring. But then the gross, and this is the gross in 1968 terms, is $30 million. It was $12 million, I think, domestically, and then $18 million internationally, which would be $250 million in today's money. So that's like making as much money as like Spider-Man No Way Home or something. Well, actually, I guess not. That movie made like $2 billion or something. Still, $250 million as opposed to 114K, or even if you look at the old numbers, 114K versus $30 million. Wow. Especially considering that it was done without the help of Hollywood, which we'll get into later as well. So yeah, that's like kind of the overview. Really like this movie, especially for the precedents and some of the elements of it. As we'll get into it, there are some things about the movie that I'm not like super thrilled about, which is why it's getting to an 8 out of 10, because there's so many things, especially in the kind of span of cinematic history, that just elevate this movie to new heights. And for a first movie of a genre, it really does hold up very well. There's just some things, there's some drags in the narrative, and then of course Barbara, the character Barbara, who we'll talk about in just a second, is just, she's insufferable. A lot of the characters are insufferable, and there's one character, Ben, who is awesome, and he makes up for everything. So that's why it's an 8 out of 10. If it was like an even more engaging story, if all the characters were great, all that kind of stuff, then this would easily be in the nines. Very good movie. And we'll get into some of the other things maybe that I have some nitpicky stuff, but 8 out of 10 is a perfect perfectly good score. And if we look at the IMDb, I think it's an 89 Metacritic score, which is really high, but it makes sense, right? Because of the precedents. And then it's got a 7.8, I think, user score, which means I'm pretty much right there, right? I'm saying 8 out of 10, so I don't feel too bad saying that. So let's get down. Let's do the breakdown of the story because you guys, for those of you who haven't seen this movie, um go watch it. If you like horror movies at all and you want to see like the origins of an entire genre of film, you could do a lot worse than watching Night of the Living Dead. And it's really short. It's like 90 minutes, maybe 92 minutes, something like that. Really short. It's about as short as a movie could be. So really not a lot of time investment there. It's on HBO Max at least, and I think it's on a few other streaming platforms as well. Go watch it. I'm going to talk pretty openly about this movie just because it has been out forever, and it's kind of one of those movies that I feel like most people have seen. So it'd just be more fun to talk about it with spoilers involved. But there's not too many spoilers. There is like a bit of a kind of twist, not twist, but kind of an ending that is a little shocking. But we don't even really have to talk about that. So I will leave some to the imagination if you haven't seen it. But honestly, this is such an archetypal story that you kind of know the story without knowing it, if that makes sense. I know I watched this movie when I was like really little and probably like 12 or 13 or something like that. It would come on AMC sometimes at night, around Halloween and all that kind of stuff. So I've seen it maybe even a couple times, but it's been probably at least 15 years. So I think it's fair that I can cover this movie. But anyway, let's get into the story. So it's pretty simple to begin with. Actually, the whole story in general is pretty simple. I love the opening shot where you have this like old country road kind of coming down the lane. It's in Pennsylvania, like rural Pennsylvania, which is cool. And the music just starts with like this kind of ominous music tone and score, which is really cool. It kind of sets the vibe of being like a kind of more epic than you would imagine for such an independent film. And then you have these two characters or two siblings. It's Barb and Johnny, I think. And they are coming to lay flowers on their father's grave, but they have to drive like 3 hours out of the city because I guess they're in like Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or something. And so they're kind of the Johnny's annoyed by that, and they had this little banter. And what's so interesting about this movie too is that it has almost like a false beginning of sorts because you think that these two characters are going to be like the two characters for the whole movie, like the main characters. Barbara does live. I'll go ahead and tell you, Johnny dies. But Barbara does live, but she honestly, her importance in the film is like completely eclipsed by a later character. So I thought that was really kind of a little interesting and unique narratively as well. So they're in this really cool graveyard. And this is, like I said, for most people, you've probably seen this scene. It's a really classic scene. But they're in this graveyard and they're having these conversations and they're kind of fighting a little bit, brother sister banter. And then the brother starts teasing her because she's like a little spooked. And he's saying like, "Oh, they're coming to get you, Barbara. They're coming to get you." And while he's doing that, there's literally like, and there's a workup to this scene as well, where there's a zombie just like walking around in the background for like a couple minutes and just slowly getting closer and closer. And they don't who I mean, if you never even heard of what a zombie is, why would you think that this guy walking around was a zombie? I mean, you just think he was some guy that was drunk or something. And so he's messing with her, being like, "They're coming to get you, huh? Look at him, he's right there. He's coming to get you." And then little does they know, like he's actually coming to get them. And so there's a little bit of ironic humor there as well. So Barbara gets grabbed by this guy, this zombie, and that's when Johnny comes in to save the day, and then he is tussling with the zombie and then falls on his head on a gravestone and dies like immediately. And you're like, "Oh wow, well Johnny's gone in the first 5 minutes of the movie." And then there's a long drawn out kind of chase scene with the first zombie and her running away, and she eventually finds this farmhouse, and the farmhouse is abandoned, or so she thinks. And then as she's looking around in the farmhouse, she finally finds Ben, who comes in later, and he's just the best character of the movie. He's like a real take charge kind of guy. He's not super scared. I mean, he is scared. Like he tells Barbara, he's like, "Hey, man, I'm scared too, but we got to do this stuff." He's like, which is like how you should be, obviously, in a survival situation. It's like, okay, I'm not just going to sit here and get eaten. I'm going to do something about this. We're in a farmhouse. Let's use the tools that we have, which I love. I am a sucker for survival horror movies. And, I can really stop the story there because that is what the rest of the movie is just, it's like a siege like a zombie siege film in a farmhouse, which is awesome. Really cool really cool premise. And I really enjoyed just like kind of that kind of welcome to the rest of the movie moment of being at the farmhouse, and then Ben is starting to like build the different kind of boards and stuff for the doors and for the windows so the zombies can't get in. And yeah, that's where the rest of the movie plays out. Eventually, like it's like kind of cool because it's only like it's about halfway in, as most people know. All of a sudden, like several characters start coming up from the basement. So this whole time they've been at the farmhouse, like fighting off zombies, there's been like 4 or 5 people underneath them that were hiding. Which once again, just like as a narrative, kind of a narrative touch point halfway through the movie, now we have new characters. I think that was cool because Barbara was getting real stale and really annoying. And it was just Ben kind of doing this on his own, which is cool on it, I guess, a little bit. But it was nice to have some new characters kind of interact with. And it was also just a cool little like twist a little bit in the story to be like, oh, there's actually real people here too. But once again, now we have some real archetypal characters, especially in Mr. Cooper, who was in the basement, and he's kind of like he was the guy that was like the take charge guy in the basement, and now you got Ben up here, who's the take charge guy. And although race doesn't really play a lot into the actual story, I think in the subtext you can see that Ben, who's a black man, is like very much like there's like a great line in the movie where he basically puts Mr. Cooper in his place because Mr. Cooper keeps being like, we need to be in the basement. We don't need to be up here. We're vulnerable up here. We need to be in the basement the whole time, and that's how we're going to get through this. And Ben is like,
well, you're her father. If you're stupid enough to go die in that trap, that's your business. However, I am not stupid enough to follow you. It is tough for the kid that her old man is so stupid. Now, you get the hell down in the cellar. You can be the boss down there. I'm boss up here.
And you're going to do what I say. And it's like, this is 1968. We'll get into this a little bit later because I've read some articles on this. I knew that there was some more into this because it's 1968 and you've got basically a black man as the leading role in the movie. Because once Barbara gets to the farmhouse and meets Ben, Barbara's out, man. She's like having anxiety attacks. She's just like in shock. She's useless. And Ben kind of takes over, which is, I think, really cool narratively too. He takes over not just as in the story, but in the narrative. Like he is now the main character. And so to have a black man as a leading role in a horror film, I believe this is the first time ever. So that's really cool. And we'll get into that a little bit more later because I've got some articles that I've read up on that, and we'll talk about some snippets from that. But as a character is really cool, and there's a really good line there where he's telling him, I'm the boss up here. But Mr. Cooper as a character is very much an archetypal character in these kind of movies, especially zombie movies. There's always that, like, or survival movies in general. When you have a group of people that are surviving, there's always that guy who is like being how do you say it? He's being the antithesis of everyone else. It's like you have two things that you're fighting in a survival horror. You're fighting the actual elements, like say nature, or say zombies, or say some kind of bugs or creatures, something, and you're also fighting the one guy in the party that is not doing anything that anyone wants. He's trying to take control for himself. He's kind of a coward, but also wants power. And there's always a character like that. In Train to Busan, which we'll talk about later, there's a annoying Mr. Cooper who is terrible in that film. But yeah, it's, once again, we're starting some precedents here. We're already having some archetypes of characters that you're going to see in later movies. So I really enjoyed that. And yeah, the story of the film is a really good element of it. But one of the issues is that some of the characters, Mr. Cooper, is as great of a character and as a foil as he is, he's also extremely annoying. And there's some other annoying characters too, just like kind of like, okay, useless kind of characters. Barb being the main one, just really annoying. Barb, really annoying. So one of the things I wanted to touch on was just the nature of the zombies. Like I was talking about earlier, I mentioned some of the things. This is a precedent when it comes to getting shot in the head. They don't call them zombies, they call them ghouls. But there's a lot of things in this movie that are very much a precedent for what zombies will be later. Obviously, it's the first movie with zombies, but it also is kind of crazy how many things are brought back to this movie when it comes to influence. Like so many different zombie movies that have maybe little tweaks here and there of what the nature of zombies are, where the virus comes from, whether it is a virus, all that kind of stuff. But some of the things are very, very similar. For example, I was really kind of surprised how fast some of the zombies were at sometimes. Also, just the nature of the zombies. Like they kind of walk sometimes kind of slow, but then sometimes they're pretty quick. Like the main zombie at the beginning of the movie, who is attacking Barb and Johnny, like he actually kind of chases after Barb. And this is one of the things that kind of diverges from a lot of later movies, is that the zombies actually pick up weapons and use them. So at the beginning, that main zombie picks up a boulder or a rock and starts beating the glass of the car that Barbara is hiding in and busts through using the rock. And then later in the movie, zombies will pick up, like, I think it was like a big giant wooden table leg, and was using that to beat on the door. Like they're using weapons. There is some, I think, was it Land of the Dead, which wasn't maybe the best one, with Dennis Hopper, and they're like learning to pick up guns and stuff and use them. But that was like a major development after a long time. I mean, Land of the Dead, Diary of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead, all those dead movies, and then we get to the end, and I think that was one of the last ones in that kind of row. And it was, yeah, it was just kind of silly, honestly. And they start talking, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it was interesting that they're like using weapons. They're being resourceful because they're supposed to be like brain dead zombies, right? Just like brains and like eat people. But nature was a little bit different in this movie. So what's interesting is the kind of slow, shambling zombies, that hitting them in the head, being cannibals, like all that kind of stuff is definitely consistent throughout most of the movies. Now, the speed of zombies is something I think changes a lot depending on what movie it is. I'm not like, to just full disclosure, I'm not like the biggest zombie fan. Like I'm not like, I don't hate zombies, but there's like, I'm not like one of those people that really like, I haven't seen all the seasons of Walking Dead and all that stuff. I think I stopped at like season 3 or something. And I like zombies in video games honestly more than I like in movies. But just to show that I do like zombie movies and some of them, and I do like a lot of like I've seen more modern zombie movies than I have seen the older ones. I just wanted to talk about some of my favorite ones from the modern era. So coming in, we'll do 5 here. Well, in order. So coming in at number 5 would be Dawn of the Dead, the remake from 2004. Growing up, that was just a really great zombie movie to me. I loved catching it on TV, and it was Zack Snyder's like first movie, which is really cool. And it really shows his style. I think doing a early Zack Snyder styled zombie movie it's just really cool. Now, full disclosure, I haven't seen the first Dawn of the Dead, the original, but I've heard that's also really good too. So I would love to get into that, and that's of course directed by George Romero. Second, on number 4, we have Zombieland, which this is a classic. Most people like this movie, and this is one of the things here too. Is it's not so much about the zombies. Like Zombieland is more about, it's a character comedy than it is actual about fighting zombies. But it's one of those things that like fighting zombies is pretty cool, and then now there's a character comedy on top of it, so it's funny and you're fighting zombies. Cool. Third is a little bit weird here. We got The Crazies. This one's like almost not a zombie movie. It's an infection movie, and people go crazy. So in this one, as you see, he's using the pitchfork. They are obviously using weapons, and they're a little bit more autonomous because they're kind of like, their brain is making them. It's closer to like what's the movie, like Wreck or Quarantine, where they're like, it's like rabies or something. It's some virus that's making them like aggressive, versus one that's making them brain dead zombies that just want to eat you. It's definitely not normal zombies, but I would say that it's zombie adjacent, especially since the original movie was done by Wes Craven, who, as we'll see later, was very much influenced by Night of the Living Dead. And then, of course, Shaun of the Dead. We got to do Shaun of the Dead, right? Number 2, one of the just best comedies of all time, just one of the best parodies of all time, I would say, and one of Edgar Wright's best films. It might be his best film besides a personal favorite of mine, Scott Pilgrim versus the World. So Shaun of the Dead is just great. It takes all those horror tropes and takes all those zombie tropes and kind of plays on them. And in that one, the zombies are really slow too. So I liked that. This one, and then yeah, I think this is the only one of the whole list where the zombies are slow, like closer to the Night of the Living Dead. Although, like I said, they do a little shambling, a little running, half running, kind of hobble run, I guess. And especially in that scene where the zombies chasing Barbara. And then number 1, Train to Busan. love Train to Busan. That movie was I've seen it a few times. It is just I uncharacteristic uncharacteristically good for a zombie movie in my opinion. Like I'm not a big like I said, I'm not a big zombie movie fan, but that's like one of my favorite movies. It's just great. It'll make you laugh, it'll make you cry, it's make you tense. The zombies in there are really cool. It's just a smart film. And that one, they're blind, and when they figure that out, like they're putting newspapers on the windows so that you can sneak away. And just the idea, I guess, of having a smart characters, like you're in a survival situation and people are actually acting smart. That's one of the things about Night of the Living Dead is you have a lot of characters that aren't acting smart, and then you got Ben, who has actually got a good head on his shoulders, which is kind of cool. And that movie, like I talked about before, and Train to Busan has that. That guy is so annoying. I don't know his name, but he's the Mr. Cooper of the movie, and he is just the worst. And by the end of the movie, he's literally just throwing survivors in front of zombies so that he can live for an extra like 2 seconds. And it's just like, you are the reason why all of this is happening, and I hate you. But anyway, so yeah, just wanted to break down some zombie movies that I liked. Just maybe give some recommendations. I think most people know those movies. If you're into zombie movies, then you know those movies. But if you haven't, if you want to get into them, I recommend that. I also saw 28 Days Later again. Like I rewatched that a little bit ago. Doesn't hold up as well, although ironically, it is a little bit more George Romero style because it's all done on like a camcorder, very low budget feeling, which is kind of cool. It's a kind of small story, so it feels a little bit like in a way that George Romero would enjoy. But anyway, so let's get on to the next thing, because the zombies in this movie and Night of the Living Dead, one of the issues with them is they're not very scary. They look mostly just like people that are like shambling around a little bit. They don't have that classic, what we now see as classic, where it's like skin falling off and like you're obviously like tattered clothes and you've seen bone in the arms and stuff. And nah, this is just people in like corpse makeup, like walking around and being like, oh, which for the time, of course, is super scary, but for audiences today, it's a little hokey. But getting into the cinematography, one of the reasons why it is still a little creepy is, well, for one, the score. To give the score the sound design and the score. One of the things about the sound design is towards the end, especially when the zombies are finally taking over the house, and there's just the sounds of all of them beating on the walls and on the wood and just kind of being mindless, and there's like almost like a drum beat, like a cacophony of zombie like beatings on walls and floors and everything. And that was really tense, and it increases that anxiety, that tension, which is really cool. And it did make it scary, like actually kind of scary. And you can definitely see why when in 1968 you're watching this movie, which is unlike anything you've ever seen. That's very scary. But going to the cinematography, one of the things I liked about the choice of black and white was really well done, because there's some scenes, I'm thinking of one in particular, where a zombie comes through the door, and when he's coming through the doorway, the light is like kind of masking his face a little bit as he comes in and out of the light and the shadow. And with the music and with him walking through really slowly, it does create an era of like an aura of like creepiness and fear, that I think definitely elevates the fact that it's just people in corpse paint. That definitely makes it a little scarier, because if you were just to see him kind of especially at the beginning, when you see the guy in broad daylight, you're just kind of like, oh, this is just some weird guy. Like he doesn't really look like a zombie necessarily. Not what we're used to in today's society. We're not used to the kind of old school zombies. So that would be kind of a tick against, but the cinematography helps it. So once again, one of these reasons why it's getting 8 out of 10 is because some of the things that are maybe that would bring it down, or being kind of accentuated, or not accentuated, but being supported and helped out by some of the things that are really good about the film, like the cinematography. Like I talked about at the top of the episode, I really liked the type of cinematography, especially with this voyeuristic feeling. It kind of goes away eventually. I feel like it gets a little bit more. What's cool about that though is that it stays consistently interesting. So even though they drop the voyeuristic angle at the beginning, they're kind of hiding behind tree. Like the camera will literally be like hiding behind a tree or following them, like they're just like they're almost like a creeper watching them, which is really cool. But then later, the cinematography changes once they get into the farmhouse. But it's always interesting. Lots of Dutch tilts, when things are going wrong, which is very classic. You know, it has that feeling of like, everything's not right. Everything's off. So lots of Dutch tilts. There's also this really creative thing that they do on top of like some fun, like low angle shots in the farmhouse. There's also a lot of really cool shots where it's following the character or the subject that the camera is focusing on. So a great example of this would be in a scene where Ben is kind of getting things together to build the barricades for the house, and so he's in the kitchen taking doors and different pieces of wood and like putting them together and nailing them and stuff like that. And as he's kind of dropping down to pick up stuff and then putting it over in another spot and stuff like that, the camera is following his movements going from down to up to over, and it kind of feels alive, but also it gives just like a really unique feeling, and maybe even like a feeling for me like this is a scene where he's like, it's time to get our act together. Let's do the building. It's not a montage per se, but it is like kind of that feeling of like, all right, taking care of business, you know, like he's getting up and he's actually doing something, whereas Barb is standing in the corner freaking out. And so I just really liked the movement of the camera too. It just makes it a much more interesting experience to watch, I guess, because it's not just a fixed camera watching the scene. That would be a lot more boring. You're doing something that is not super interesting, which is just picking up pieces of wood or a door and putting it in another spot. But because the camera is following him, it's doing something interesting. And I would say that's the most consistent thing about the cinematography in this film, is that it's always doing something a little interesting. So yeah, I really enjoyed the cinematography. We're kind of running over here on time, so let's keep going. Another great thing about this movie is the practical effects. So big, just three big points on the practical effects. You've got there's one scene at the very beginning of the movie where she comes into the farmhouse and she's looking through and it's abandoned, and she finds a corpse, and literally the corpse is like half, like the flesh is like half eaten or half stripped from its face, and you can see its eyeballs come out, and it's like it's very visceral, especially for 1968. It's like you could definitely tell people being like, oh my god, like not used to seeing that kind of like gore and just like practical effects in a film at that time. And then later there's this great scene where Barbara and Ben are fighting off a small little wave of zombies at the beginning of their farmhouse time, and he has to take a tire iron. Ben does, and he's like fighting a guy, and then he takes the tire iron, and it doesn't show you him do it, but you can hear it. He stabs the tire iron through their skull, and you can hear it, and you're like, ooh. And once again, sometimes it's better not to show them, because then you can really feel that's what they're doing. But then the next shot is of him either taking it out or he's already taken it out, and you see the hole in the skull with the tire iron that was in it. And it's like that was very, for 1968, like, whoa, you're seeing like tire iron through someone's skull. It's pretty crazy. That definitely stood out to me. And then, of course, once there's the big reveal, which is really cool how they do it in the story, where they're kind of over time following the radio and following people talking on the announcers on the radio, kind of telling them what's happening, like world building what's happening with the zombie invasion. And that's when they finally reveal, like, yes, we can confirm they're eating the corpses, they're eating the flesh of the dead, basically. And it's like, whoa, like for the time, of course, what is like the most taboo thing that these living dead creatures could do? And that's eat people. So because I mean, obviously cannibalism is up there, probably the most taboo thing in across all societies, besides very few hunter-gatherer societies. So it's really cool. You can kind of see how they came up with that just right there in this movie. And of course, it's a mainstay now in all the zombie movies. If there's one thing, maybe two things that are the staples in every zombie movie, no matter how they try to change it around, it's that they eat flesh and they have to be shot in the head. If they have to be brain dead to stop moving. So yeah, eating flesh, the tire iron, and the half-eaten face, like there's a lot of precedents here. There's just a lot of things that the practical effects were doing, especially on this low budget, that is just not it was just not seen at the time. Very influential, which will get us into our last thing here, which is talking a little bit more about that precedence that I mentioned at the beginning. I looked at a couple articles on kind of I just want to know kind of the story behind the story, if that makes sense. And one of the big things is that George Romero was definitely doing this in a kind of ragtag way. Yeah, you get the feeling when you're watching the movie that it feels like a rogue operation almost, because of the way that it's filmed in this independent style. It's not necessarily a B movie, but it's just like, I mean, it is obviously a B movie, but it doesn't have like the classic B movie vibes. It just feels like it feels a little special, I think. It just feels like it's like a rogue operation. Like the camera work and just the style of it, the whole thing just feels like fresh, it feels new, and it feels like non-Hollywood, I guess, is what I mean by rogue. It definitely doesn't seem like a conventional production, and yet it holds up really well. And so what's the deal with that? And he very specifically was trying to do things outside of Hollywood, because he didn't want to basically be a slave to the institutions of Hollywood. Didn't want people changing his movies and stuff like that. And throughout his career, he made an entire career not doing that, trying not to team up with people. I think he only teamed up one time with Warner Brothers to do Creepshow. But other than that, he stayed very true to himself and just said, these are the movies that I want to do. And I want to have creative freedom over those movies. With that, he's not the first person to do that, actually. As I'm reading in this article, of course, I didn't even think about it, but Roger Corman, who is very famous for being someone who is a very cheap, fast director, making a lot of small but cheap movies, especially those a run of Edgar Allan Poe movies I think in the 50s. And so he was also doing it outside of Hollywood. Everything he did was he kind of made his own company, and he had independent distributors that he would work with to get the movies in theatrical releases and stuff like that. So there was a precedence before Romero, but I think there was something fresh about the way he did this, especially just like with the small 35 millimeter camera and a small budget. And then also it was mostly propagated by word of mouth at first, and then it kind of came out that way. But because it was so successful, and it kind of showed that you could make, like, it inspired other horror directors that say, hey, I can make this movie and I don't have to go to LA to do it, because he also did it in Pennsylvania. This is not, in LA. So it was really interesting to see that too. I think a lot of up and coming directors saw this movie and it taught them, like, hey, I don't need to go to LA to make movies like this. And so this article by Kristen Hunt about this style of filmmaking that Romero was not pioneering, but maybe popularizing more than Corman was doing. I don't know. Corman became so popular and so kind of rich off of this. He became a bit of a mini mogul, as the article had spoken about. But when the article talks about was done outside of Hollywood and how it inspired people, there's a great quote here I have where it said, what it showed was you didn't need that much money. You didn't need to be in LA, and you could do this in your hometown with a few friends, and you could have a huge impact. This is a quote from another guy from Shock Value, Jason Zinoman. And he was talking to NPR, and he said, when I talk to all of these directors, John Carpenter, Wes Craven, Tobe Hooper, everyone has a story about when they saw Night of the Living Dead. And when you look at those three names, Carpenter, Craven, and Hooper, what are you thinking about? You're thinking about some of the biggest kind of rogue directors of the 70s. Carpenter, of course, popularizing slashers by making Halloween. Hooper, of course, basically creating a whole new style of horror film and terror film in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, possibly even being a bit of a slasher in its own right. Not in the quintessential style, but in a new style. He definitely starts the final girl trope, right? Because there's a final girl in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And then, of course, you have Wes Craven, who, I mean, The Crazies, that was in the 70s. And then Last House on the Left was a bit of a revenge slasher thing, I guess. And then, he makes one of the most famous slashers of all time, which is Scream. That's later, but it's a slasher talking about slashers. And then, of course, Nightmare on Elm Street. That's his big slasher franchise. So 3 of the biggest slasher directors of all time are looking at Night of the Living Dead as one of their biggest influences. So you can see how this movie not only taught them how to change horror, but also how to make horror in the industry, and saying we don't have to do it through Hollywood. We can do it in our own way, in our own areas. And that was really cool. I really like how this movie has that kind of precedence. And then there's the other side of the precedence, which is, like I alluded to before, Ben's character, played by Duane Jones. I mean, this is the first time that we've had a black leading man in a horror film, and in a time that is in 1968. Detroit riots. I mean, 68 was a rough time. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. There were tons of. We'll get into it. Actually, there's a great quote here. It's kind of long, but it's worth reading. Night of the Living Dead holds an important space in Black history. Duane Jones was one of the first African Americans to have a lead role in a mainstream horror film. This is even more notable because there was no mention of Ben's race in the film. The director George Romero said that the character wasn't written to be a black man. Duane Jones had simply given the best audition, so they hired him. In a time period as tumultuous as the late 1960s, when black people were participating in sit-ins, planning marches, receiving violent pushback from the white Americans, from white America at every step of the way, Ben was taking charge, leading a group of white people to safety. Duane Jones's performance as Ben showed audiences around the country and the world that black people could have dynamic leaders. We could play more than side characters or troublemakers, and our storyline should hold more substance than just making a social commentary stance. So yeah, I mean, that's what's interesting too about this is that the Ben's character being black, like in the story, it's not a big deal. Like I said, I think it's more like what you can read into it on like the kind of the meta narrative, I guess, a little bit. But it wasn't just social commentary. It was just like he said, or like she said. That article, by the way, was the Michigan Daily by Camille Moore, and she was saying, it was dynamic leaders. This is like doesn't have to be the leader of a march. This is just a guy who is a good leader in this situation, and he just happens to be black, and it just means black people have they contain multitudes. They're not pigeonholed by different stereotypes and stuff like that. So I really liked that. And everything I've heard about Duane Jones, he really just gave a good performance. And that's all that Romero wanted to see. And so he rewrote the character for Duane Jones once he got the audition, but he didn't rewrite it to be more black. He just rewrote it to be more like the way that Duane Jones was playing the character in the audition, which I think was great because it is very clear if you watch this movie, Ben is the best character and he's the thing that saves this movie, because it is really nice to see a character take charge and in the face of all these people that don't know what they're doing, or in the case of Mr. Cooper, thinks he knows what he's doing, but he doesn't. And so it was just, yeah, I love that precedence as well. There's a lot of things to enjoy about this movie, and that's 8 out of 10 is more than fair. Like I said, the reason why it's not higher is just because a lot of those characters were annoying, and in between kind of the time before, like after the first zombie wave at the farmhouse, and then when the people come in from the basement, it just kind of drags a little bit, and then there's a little bit after the people come in that drags a little bit. There's just some, for a movie that's 92 minutes long, it drags a little bit too much in places. And then of course the zombies are just not that menacing. There are parts where they can be, and like I said, at the end it kind of gets a little bit more intense, but for the most part we're desensitized to zombies. So I'm basing this off of my enjoyment level. There's a lot to love. There is a lot that is intriguing. 8 out of 10 is more than fair for a movie like this. So if it was not so precedential, I'd maybe give it a 7. But just with all this stuff added onto it, 8 out of 10 is more than fair. So I ran way over, tried to be a little bit more organized this time, and realized that, especially with a movie like this that is so loaded with all kinds of facts and all kinds of precedents. I hope you guys enjoyed the Night of the Living Dead, or Night of the ... theme. I really did. The first movie was kind of a letdown, but of course Night of the Creeps, and then this movie, I really enjoyed this theme. Night of the Living Dead was the easy one to enjoy. Night of the Creeps was definitely a big surprise. Night of the Comet was a big letdown. So that's how it goes, though. That's what we're trying to do here. I don't know what I'm doing for the next theme. It's a big one because it is episode 100, which is a big thing for me. We'll talk about more of that later when I figure out what the theme is. But I hope you guys have a great week this week, and I will see you next Friday.